On this week's episode of Scaffolds, I give a brief update on some thoughts on late season insect management. Carrick talks fruit rots and late season diseases, and Anna gives us our state of the state update on degree day accumulation and trap captures. I have a very quick update this week. I did want to mention that we do have two decently large-sized grants that I can't actually talk about that were accepted and funded, and I will be mentioning them maybe at the IFTA tour if that ends up working out time-wise for us to be able to announce, and the other one probably sometime next spring. I did want to remind everyone in Western New York that at this time on Tuesday of next week will be the second annual Western New York Fruit Growers Tour. And then also if you're in Western New York on the 14th, which is next Wednesday, is the Reality Research Tour. So I will be speaking at both, and I look forward to seeing you there. I wanted to mention this week the importance of this late season pre-harvest scouting to make some critical decisions about insect treatments in the late season. So one of the biggest concerns for everyone, I think, at least in the insect world, is the internal leps, or oriental fruit moth, and codling moth, and oblique-banded leaf roller. It's really important to get out there and take a look at fruit pre-harvest to see what damage you're seeing, especially if you don't have traps. If you have traps, our traps we're still capturing, not at super high levels, but it's time to start thinking about what treatments you might put on pre-harvest and timing them with your planned harvest. And another important thing is understanding which treatments for the internal lepidopterans you've used earlier this season. So one thing that we can be very proud of in New York is a lot of our AIs still work quite well, where in Pennsylvania, I know there has been some resistance issues. So it's important to use a different class of insecticide for each generation of the internal lep. So because this is trailing off, and some areas do experience a third generation, even if it's smaller or more mild, it's important to consider what AIs you've previously used. I do want to mention that I think the most flexible treatment for the internal leps when it comes to pre-harvest interval, because it is 0 days PHI, is using a BT product. Most of the other products seem to vary amongst their classes. So for example, Alticor can be 5 days pre-harvest. Another option would be sprayable pheromone, but I wouldn't recommend that this late in the season. That's something that you want to start the season off with strong. Of course, we could do more research to figure out if this is an effective treatment, maybe combined with BT. The other pest to consider is apple maggots. If you are trapping, they can still be emerging sporadically in the late season, and the control options, well, I think favorably maybe a sale would be a good choice for late season apple maggots. In Western New York, not super sure about Eastern New York, but in Western New York, we are not having a ton of flight of the black stem borer, but we are having continued flight of Anisandrus maish. I would recommend talking to your local IPM specialist or regional IPM specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension to talk about what flight activity might look like in your region. But if you do have any active fire blight infections from the year, this could be something that could be attractive to them in this late season flight. The other pest to consider, which I mentioned a couple weeks ago, is the brown marmorated stink bug, and continued scouting for that until the very last apple is harvested is critical because late season management may be necessary. I do think a lot of the late season recommendations include pyrethroids, and recently we have found that pyrethroids and woolly apple aphids, depending on which AI, can be not a match, meaning that you could be killing off your beneficials and making the woolly apple aphids worse. So careful consideration of using pyrethroids, I think, is warranted in the late season. And if you are still having persistent populations of woolly apple aphid and you have not used up your 2 applications of the 7 ounce per acre of Safina, that is a good consideration. It is soft on the beneficials, as we have seen in some of our own research work. So that's my update for this week. Hoping to have Dr. Kevin Rice on next week from Virginia Tech to talk a little bit more about late season lep management and also some of his work with mating disruption. So hopefully that works out, and you will hear from me again next week. And then on our final episode in 2 weeks, we are hoping to have Vaughn Gingrich on, like we did last season, for a season finale to discuss what worked and what didn't for the season.
Well, it's a lazy, hot, blistering Sunday afternoon, August 4th. Can't think of anything better to do than record scouts. All right, where are we now? We're deep in that 3rd through 9th cover. We've had a lot of drama with leaf spots throughout the state. And as we get closer to harvest, I suspect we'll see some trouble with fruit spots if it constantly keeps up with this hot weather and heavy rain showers that drop an inch of rain and then move on and leave the humidity at an all-time high. What are our troublesome summer fruit diseases? We've talked about them before. We're going to move in again because now I think we're in the crux of starting to see their effects. We got fly speck sooty blotch, little tiny, maybe looks like soot on apples with little tiny, the fly speck itself is little tiny pinpoint pepper grain looking things. They're only on the surface of the fruit. It does not change the flavor, the taste, the profile, or your ability to make cider from it, but it can completely ruin it for the fresh market. Then we got black and white rot, which can look very similar. You'll know if you have black rot if you touch the surface of the apple itself and it's smooth and kind of hard. If you have a white rot apple, finger will go deep inside it, a bag of applesauce. And these are caused by Botrytis, and these typically occur as late infections from bloom to early fruit development. And now, where we are, close to fall rains or late summer rains and wounding of mature fruits, birds, herbicides, little bits of sand. And if they don't happen now, they can show up in storage and lead to a lot of pack out rejections. So it's going to be worse in warmer, sandier areas. I'd like to say Hudson Valley and Long Island, but it seems like everywhere has got 85-degree weather or higher these days. And maybe there'll be some relentement from it, but it usually comes with a lot of rain, which is not good. And this is the bitter rot. These will be bigger sunken lesions, might show up around a bird peck or a little tiny spot of herbicide damage or an extremely susceptible cultivar shown below is Fortune. They're sort of just melted with this disease for some reason. A big problem in organic operations, and the multi-site protectant fungicides just don't do it against these Calototricum species. You get them by your pedifall fungicides going with those single sites, and then of course our summer fungicide programs, and then that last pre-harvest single-site fungicide application. The key to beating these things is, oh no, I used to say pedifall to 2nd cover. Now I'm saying pedifall to 4th cover, mainly because we got other players in the system. We got apple blotch caused by diplocarpin. The asexual form is Marsanina, and we know it as Marsanina blotch as well, or MLB, Marsanina leaf blight. And also at this time, the initial inoculum for fly speck, sooty blotch, and rots is really, really high. So you beat these with the QOIs, the SDHIs, and your DMIs. And if you did this, even typically in the old days for pedifall to 2nd cover, and just stopped and quit, it was pretty much as good as doing a full program, a full summer program of biopesticides and Captan. That is about 2.5 pounds of the 80% Captan with about a half rate of phos acid fungicide, which was a great combo. But you had to spray it all summer. I mean, now I'd say if you're having a lot of rain, put one in, but this is mostly for 3rd cover. We're sort of out of the window for apple blotch, but it could come back if we get a lot of fall rains. I think we might have beaten it this year. The MLB, the Marsanina leaf blight, is sort of over at this stage, but you could come in now, and where we are is with the heavy rains. Consider about, if you get them 1.5 to 2 inches of rain, we sort of passed the 3 to 5th cover window, and now we're into these sort of like sort of the home stretch, if you will. You might want to consider another single site fungicide the next time you get about 2 inches to 1.5 inches of rain. And this is to protect your fruit rods, QOI, SDHI, or DMI, whatever you have left that you haven't used all 4 of. And watch out for the combination products because they take 2 uses with 1 application. So if it's less than this and you still feel like I got to put something on, the Captan phos acid at that low rate we mentioned before is pretty good. Now, also, for your light periods, you could do Xyram, and I'm a little concerned that maybe losing it might cause some other issues like necrotic leaf blight. We talked about that maybe last week or the week before. You could go with the double nickel. I really had great luck with any of the polyoxin D programs, products themselves like OSO, PhD, and Lifeguard, and Howler and Thea. I mentioned Howler, and specifically because I learned at a meeting that this Pseudomonas makes a naturally occurring metabolite that is a precursor of fludioxonil, a post-harvest fungicide. And it might explain its exceptional performance in field trials that we've noticed as a biological. So something to consider. As we get down to that last application, this is where you finish strong with a low PHI, SDHI, QOI, or DMI prior. Maravon and Sevia have that magical 0, which means you could put it on right before harvest and then pick it. Or even a Luna Sensation Spire Super, pretty good. 14 days out, you could start with one of those 14-day PHI materials, and then end off with a 0. And that's just going to keep all the diseases down in storage. Don't let those things, latent infections, show up with bitter rot, fly speck, sooty blotch, scab even, or penicillium. So you might be wondering, sounds like I need to save all my single site fungicides for post bloom. That's kind of what we're thinking. While we still have copper and mancozeb, I'm really pushing just going hard on the protectants from green tip to bloom. They work well on apple scab. I don't think we need the other things at that point. There's so many other diseases coming in later that can cause trouble. So if you have 5 days of rain in that early period, don't forget Vanguard or Scala, the anilinoprividine fungicides, completely different class that's going to be hard to run out of 4 applications of, or Dodine Sillet, which is quite good. All right. So what other weird summer fruit issues could we possibly run into? As I start to get into fall and things start to come out of storage and get sold, or go into storage and get sold, it's time to keep an eye out for moldy core. If you cut things, we did have a lot of rain around Powder Fall. These are sort of latent fungal infections that happen really early in fruit development. You can see around the seed area, there's fully developed seeds. There's this white mycelium that looks a little bit like spider webbing. It's gross. It doesn't cause a health concern, no matter who is telling you it does. And usually these aren't dangerous fungi that are making aflatoxins, but whatever. Whoever's throwing your fruit away is because of this problem is just as bad as might as well be a health concern. It's a concern to your own health as you try to grow apples and survive. For the most part, these are caused by innocuous fungi. That evil Botrysphaeria could be one that's rotting your fruit, could be Alternaria, Cladosporium, common bathtub mold, and in rare cases, Penicillium. I haven't really seen a lot of Penicillium in this one. You won't see them now. You'll see them in storage, and they'll be confined around the core. And it's terribly frustrating because it will end up causing your fruit to be rejected. So what's the other one that we have to deal with? Callus core. And this is going to look like moldy core, but it's not. If you get a lot of rain, these things might build up callus tissue. A huge influx of water in the late and developing season, like maybe we've had, could cause these sort of undifferentiated callus tissue around the seed cavities. I got some of these one fall when I was teaching class, cut it open, popped it into the microscope. I was like, well, this doesn't look like mycelium at all. Turns out it's very firm crystalline tissue. It's not really soft like a spider web. It's kind of crunchy. So I popped it under the microscope, found a German paper looking at undifferentiated callus tissue in apples. And I was like, oh, it's callus core. Definitely not a health concern. No off flavor, but tell that to the person throwing your apples in the trash. So something to think about. Keep an eye out for it. It's not bad. Eat them yourself, I suppose. And it's a physiological problem that's often mistaken for moldy core in certain varieties. Now, that doesn't stop someone from showing callus core on a fact sheet or web page about moldy core as well. And that's happened from time to time. And people have used that to throw your apples away or show you about apples being thrown away. What else do we got? Late summer diseases. I want to talk a little bit more about the canker things. As we're going into the fall, we could get a lot of rain. And I talked about tree cankers early, but I didn't talk about some of the later season tree cankers. We want to make sure we get these in before we reach the end of the season and start the winter tox circuit as well. So Phytophthora, this can happen, and it can show up even at the top of a hill in seemingly well-drained soils if the cultivars are susceptible enough. This is the cultivar Topaz right here. I was in Ohio State, and these things will destroy the roots, the crowns, the graft union. They'll cause sort of stunting, yellowing of the foliage. That's just not a terrible picture. That's just really yellow apples and small premature colored fruit. They might be a little bit advanced as the tree's like, oh gosh, we got to move this through. What does it look like? Well, this is the type of thing that we saw. You'll scrape away the bark and you'll see an orangish brown spreading lesion. Basically, this would just keep creeping up the tree itself, darkly delineated margins. You can already tell that something is not particularly good. And this is an active moving infection. You can definitely see it's kind of moist. There's a lot of leaves right down in there, locking in that moisture right around just above the graft union. And then what can make things really weird and complicated is that once this is killed by Phytophthora, you get a whole bunch of other wood decay fungi and bacteria and other things that can kind of sort of confound the diagnosis. So how this thing works, there are these motile spores called zoospores, and they are released from a large fungal spore-like sac and heavily saturated soil. So these things are water motile, and typically they might infect as the snow melts and spring temperatures rise, or they could be activated in a heavy, wet, rainy year. This Phytophthora is ubiquitous. It's all in our vegetable fields and it's in our forests. A lot of different species, each attack different types of crops, but there are some that go to apples. Usually it's in low-lying areas of poorly drained spots. However, if we get heavy rains, infected nursery stock, or highly susceptible cultivars like poor topaz, you can even see this on high ground. I've seen it in areas that were seemingly exceptionally well drained. They can make a big, heavily walled survival structure in the ground that can become activated later and germinate into one of these sacs that makes the motile spores. And that might explain how we see it in the later season. So how to beat this? If you're already planting on a hill, you already did that one. You did the best you could. Resistant rootstocks are good. B9 and the Geneva series are often resistant to this. But all that being said, even if you plant a topaz or a Cox orange pippin and get this sort of collar rot, the little motile spores can be splashed up onto the scion area above the graft union, particularly if there's a lot of weeds and a lot of moisture, and cause an infection right above if it's really sort of rainy. So what do? You can apply mefenoxam, which is quite expensive. Soil drench, about 0.5 pints per 100 gallons. There is resistance to this, but I don't think we're using it enough on our apple trees to be too concerned about resistance in this pathosystem. Resistance in other systems where it's used more frequently. They might have vegetables, but they're different species. It's not necessarily going to attack apple. Probably the best bet are your phos acid fungicides, phosphorus acid salts. There's a variety of different materials, Prophyte, Phostrol, Rampart. You apply these to the foliage, and then they get translocated to the roots. And you apply them about every 60-day interval. You'll do it in the spring. Yes, if you're seeing it now, you might be able to save the tree, because they can stop or rest the system while it's happening. If you see it now, apply it. And then when it comes back to next spring, do it again. Winter injury. Some of my favorite things. This can happen. And usually it's in the case of, oh, my bark is broken and cracked. I don't know what caused it. This is the first year I've noticed it. And typically, if you might see it, it's a variety of different things that can cause bark cracking and what might be winter injury. It's usually this crotch angles in the tree are usually the last parts to harden off, right below those first big scaffolds. And that's where you might see bark cracking first. And you'll see some browning of the phloem, which is white, and cambium's usually green-white. You might see this sort of irregularly split patches, and the bark could split and peel as well. Things could look pretty darn healthy for the longest period of time. You might see just the slightest crack of a bark one year, and then as you peel it back or wait other years, the bark will peel back for you, as this sort of winter injury is a compounding problem. It's sort of exposing the tree to the elements and killing that phloem and xylem, preventing it from getting a lot of nutrition. And it may be that it looked fine one year and slowly died the next. Other cankers can form as the winter injury, sort of a chronic compounding problem over the years. And you can get wood decay fungi. You can get this little fun genetic model for eukaryote organisms like us. This guy's a phylum. It looks kind of like a little white oyster, and it will oftentimes form in the cracks on dead fire blight killed shoots, or in this case, if you get a canker resulting from winter injury or bark, and you might think, oh my gosh, this guy's a phylum. It is the cause. No, not usually. It's not really considered a strong pathogen. It's fairly weakly pathogenic, and something that geneticists use to understand genetics in organisms like us and animals, because it's very easy to grow. How does it happen? Well, we can get cold temperatures in general, or rapid temperature changes in general, such as the ones I experience when I drive to the winter fruit schools, and it's 75 degrees one day and 25 degrees the next. If we start having early spring or spring in February, winter weather, where it's just hot, cold, this can happen. It's going to be worse in low-lying areas, and it's going to be worse in poorly drained soils, because trees will just keep growing into the later season and harden off much later than normal, meaning they're sort of green and active when the first cold snap hits, causing just the slightest pip of injury. Now there is southwest injury, and this is where the sun rises. It warms up the bark to about 30 degrees, and then warms up the bark greater than 30 degrees, and then cools down at night. Or about, if it's in the dead of the winter, it might be 55 degrees in the day. That bark temperature can get so high that it will heat up because of the sunlight. And then this is where you put the tree guard or the white paint. But if it's fallen apart, you might run into some issues. So it also can occur all around the entire tree if the whole day temperature warms up to 55 and is followed by another 25-degree day, such as those days that we often see in the winter. You can also watch out with a little, you can get these ice collars as well. I've seen my trees settling in and leaving a depression around the root ball area, and this can allow water to collect in it and refreeze during these sort of rapid temperature changes. How do you beat winter injury? This is really kind of hard because you can't really control the weather, but you can refresh your tree guards. You can repaint tree bases. All of those things help. Watch out for low-lying areas and poorly drained soil. The trees will keep growing. Don't over-irrigate fertilizer. The trees will grow late into the fall. And make sure to take care with herbicide use. These things don't directly hurt the tree, but over many, many years, they can get sort of mild chronic injury that might decrease cold hardiness, and they'll be a little more susceptible to these things, and their bark might split after a couple of years, even 3 to 5 of these sort of rapid temperature changes. Late summer pruning can reinvigorate things and decrease cold hardiness as well. And then there's some rootstock series. The Geneva 935 has some pretty good cold tolerance as well. And the Scion varieties can be a little more susceptible to these things as well. Empire, Fuji, and Rome, pretty susceptible to winter injury. Macintosh and Gala, not so much. And you might ask, well, what about all the other things that we plant now? Who knows? Hasn't been studied in a while. I would suspect that anything that grows late into the season could be an issue with winter injury. All right, well, that's it for this week. Talk to you next week.
And now for the State of the State, your weekly roundup of phenology and decree day accumulations from the major fruit production regions of the state. As always, I'm Anna Wallace with the New York State IPM program at Cornell, and I'll be sharing information aggregated from the regional specialists as well as my own observations. Starting with a quick recap of the month of July, now that we're moving into August. July was a month of extreme conditions across the Northeast. This July was one of the all-time hottest months on record for a number of different sites across the Northeast region, according to the Northeast Regional Climate Center. It was the hottest on record for some cities, including Albany, New York, and Hartford, Connecticut, and it was the second hottest for Syracuse, New York, Baltimore, Maryland, Concord, New Hampshire, and Portland, Maine. Most of New York was 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than average. There was also excessive rainfall in many places. Over 200% rainfall compared to average was reported in parts of northern New York, with up to 7 to 8 inches recorded in a single day. Binghamton, New York was the 6th wettest July on record. In stark contrast, other parts of the Northeast were in excessive drought for most of July. Fortunately, this was not in most of New York, but in other states, including southern parts of New Hampshire and Vermont, and western or southwestern parts of Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Maryland. And as we know, there were many extreme storms, including tornadoes, reported across New York throughout the month of July, mostly in the second and third weeks of July. Over 12 tornadoes were reported in parts of western and central New York. Governor Hochul announced a state of emergency and made $11 million of funding available for homeowners and municipalities. So if you experience any kind of extreme damage from these extreme weather events, we recommend that you reach out to your local township for more information. Last week, the last week of July and the 1st of August, we had slightly less extreme conditions, a little bit more moderate temperatures, and more consistent, gentle rainfall. Although it was still hot and humid, it was slightly more moderate than the worst part of July, with highs in the 80s across the state and lows remaining in the upper 60s to low 70s. There were a few rainfall events which were nice to replenish soil moisture, with precipitation mostly on Tuesday to Wednesday last week, some more again on Friday in several parts of the state, and again on Monday night this week. Between 1 to 2 inches of precipitation were recorded in most places across the state, which is great moving into harvest as we'll need that soil moisture for fruit sizing. Now looking at the forecast for this week, next week, and the coming month. Forecasts are continuing to expect hot, humid conditions with plenty of precipitation. This week, rainfall could be as much as 2 to 3 inches, with several precipitation events in the forecast, although it is expected to be a little bit cooler or more moderate than it has been at the worst part of July. In the 6 to 10-day outlook from the NOAA Climate Prediction Center, this is the first time in the season that cooler than average temperatures are expected. Near normal precipitation or slightly above average precipitation is expected. However, over the course of August, the entire month is expected to return to heat with above average temperatures and precipitation. Looking at phenology across the state now, we are approaching harvest and fruit is coloring and sizing well. Last-minute hand thinning is taking place. Soil moisture is good, which will contribute to fruit size. Summer pruning and reflective fabric, as well as other options for fruit color, are being deployed in some places. Also, sunburn treatments are also being considered in some locations. We are expecting an early harvest with the heat and the early season. Degree day accumulation compared to averages indicates that we are about 7 to 10 days ahead of normal across most of the state. So be sure to be out looking at fruit earlier than you would anticipate so you can get an idea of how early your harvest is going to be. The first harvest maturity reports are being produced by Cornell Cooperative Extension teams across the state, so we encourage you to be looking at those reports and comparing the numbers reported there to fruit on your farm. In the Hudson Valley, stone fruit harvest is continuing with lots of peaches and plums. Apples are coloring and sizing well, with the very earliest varieties being picked in the lower part of the Hudson Valley now, including Pristine, Jersey Max, and other early varieties. In the rest of the state, it's about a week or so behind. Sites right near the lake in the Lake Ontario region are similar degree day accumulations to the Champlain Valley this year, which is something that we often see. And so things are moving rapidly toward harvest, again, about 7 to 10 days earlier than average. Now moving into some upcoming pest events. Monique gave a great summary of end-of-season considerations for scouting and cover sprays. It's consistent with what I'm seeing and what regional extension specialists are reporting around the state. Apple maggot continues to be one of the insects at the forefront of spray programs at this time. We're continuing to have trap captures around the state, although it's been somewhat low in some locations. In other places, we've been above threshold for several weeks now, and management is important, but it's a very site-specific insect, so we encourage you to be scouting and monitoring at your location. Just a reminder that we are monitoring at this point in the season with red spheres coated with sticky tanglefoot, and those are capturing the ovipositing females. If you're using baited traps, the threshold is 5 flies per baited trap, and unbaited traps, the threshold is 1 to 2 per trap. Codling moth is another insect that we're paying close attention to. In the Hudson Valley, the second generation larval emergence was about a week or 2 ago, so timing for an insecticide that was targeting larval emergence would have been around that time. The follow-up application 10 to 14 days later would be about this week or the end of last week, so hopefully you're covered, especially before all the rain that's coming. In the Lake Ontario and Capital region, the appropriate timing for the emergence of that insect looks to be about the end of last week or the beginning of this week, and the Champlain Valley is right behind that, maybe at the end of this week. We're getting more reports of internal feeding this year from lepidopteran insects, so just remembering when you're cutting fruit open and looking at damage to try to identify which insects are active and present. Codling moth prefer to feed on the seeds, so they'll tunnel straight into the center of the fruit toward those locules, either from the calyx end or from the side of the fruit, and feed directly on the seeds. That's sort of characteristic of codling moth. OFM and lesser appleworm may do similar tunneling directly toward the center of the fruit, but they don't often feed on the seeds, so that's one way to differentiate those insects. For this second generation in a given season, it's really important to remember to rotate chemistries because this insect can be endemic in the orchard, and we need to be very careful about managing resistance to insecticides. So whatever you chose for the first generation management, make sure to be choosing a different chemistry for this second generation. Oblique-banded leaf roller trap captures were very low this week, or none in some locations. In the Hudson Valley, the second generation moth flight is declining, and it's not an appropriate timing for insecticide applications at this time. In other parts of the state, Western New York, Capital Region, and the Champlain Valley, there was a sort of an uptick in the second generation last week or a little bit before that, indicating that that second generation is still active, but it's not the appropriate time for an insecticide at this time. In this warmer year and earlier season, it's more likely that we might see damage later into the season for this insect. So it's important to continue scouting, looking for terminals that might be webbed or feeding on the surface of the fruit, just on the skin or slightly under the skin, which would be oblique-banded leaf roller or other leaf roller damage. We are continuing to see mites in many locations across the state, both two-spotted spider mites and European red mites. We're also seeing lots of natural enemies, predatory mites, and lacewings, which can help manage these insects. So as you're scouting for mites, be sure to be scouting for those natural enemies as well. Woolly apple aphid continues to be active. It's been managed very effectively in many places, but in other locations, colonies continue to increase with more wool and more movement to leaf axils. And so be sure to be looking at those insects and thinking about management, especially as we approach harvest. Japanese beetles continue to be active. We're also seeing brown marmorated stink bug and other stink bugs active. They're around the second generation nymphs and some early adults now in the Hudson Valley. We're seeing a little bit of damage on peaches in the form of cat facing, and then on a few apples and a few high pressure blocks. Typically we see this around the edge of plantings. You can effectively manage them with a border spray, so you might want to consider a border spray if you have pressure from this insect. You can be monitoring for them with either Tedder's traps, which are the black pyramid traps. The threshold for those traps is 10 insects per trap per week, or you can be using clear sticky panels where the threshold is around 3 to 4 insects per week. In either case, there is a pheromone lure that is associated with those traps. These insects typically move into apple orchards from hedgerows or after a soy or cornfield or some other crop is harvested nearby. So if that's taking place in your region, just be paying attention as those insects can move in pretty quickly. Now looking at some diseases, we are seeing more fruit rats and getting more reports of fruit rats from places across the state this week. Bitter rot is showing up in a lot of places. This looks like a brown, soft rot lesion on the fruit, which can grow quite large and often has concentric circles. You can also be looking for orange fruiting bodies from the fungus emerging from those lesions. If you cut the lesion in half toward the center of the fruit, you'll see a V shape, and that's also characteristic of bitter rot. We're also seeing some frog eye leaf spot on leaf lesions, and that's Botrosphaeria, which can also cause a fruit rot, larger circular lesions on the fruit. We're seeing a little bit of rust in susceptible cultivars in high pressure areas on the leaves. This is quite easy to identify, bright orange lesions with spores, but also it can cause lesions on fruit where there's really high pressure in susceptible cultivars. Sooty blotch and fly speck is another summer disease with high risk due to all of the rain and wetness and humidity we've had this season. So be looking for that disease at this time. We're starting to see more leaf yellow spotting showing up in many places across the state this week and last. This can be several different things. So if you're looking for help diagnosing it, we recommend that you send a picture or an email to one of the extension specialists so that we can help you diagnose it. There are different diseases, Marsanina and Glomerella, which can be causing yellow leaf spotting. There's also a physiological disorder called necrotic leaf blotch, which is actually related to a zinc deficiency, which does show up this time in Golden Delicious and Golden related cultivars. So you can be looking for that at this time of year as well. We are also seeing declining trees in a lot of places across the state at this time. We typically see decline at this time of year as we get close to harvest and the trees collapse under any kind of stress that they're experiencing and supporting the crop. If you are experiencing collapse in your orchard, we encourage you to reach out to us. Jason Londo is conducting some research with his graduate student, Kenneth, and we are collecting information via a survey with them. A link to that survey is in the show notes if you would like to contribute. And now here are the current degree days in the major fruit-producing regions of the state. Throughout the season, we've been aligning this information with some previous work that was done by Art and Yellow related to Macintosh phenology and degree days with a base 43 temperature. Degree day accumulations base 43 Fahrenheit for NEWA stations across New York from January 1st through August 5th were in Geneva, 2,872, Highland at the Hudson Valley Research Lab, 3,093, Clifton Park, 2,929, Peru, 2,552, Medina, an inland site, 2,776, Appleton North, a lake site, 2,628, Fairville, an inland site, 2,742, and Williamson, a lake site, 2,786. As always, this table of phenology and degree day accumulations, as well as upcoming pest events, is included in the show notes. That's all for now, and good luck until next week.